Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera. Saya Syamsan Johari dan ini Agenda Awani. Hari ini kita bercakap mengenai strategi ASEAN kepada Amerika Syarikat dan saya ada seorang tamu yang dijemput khas dari Washington. Dan izinkan saya berbahasa Inggeris. And I'm very honoured to have Mr. Daniel Russel, Assistant Secretary, Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, U.S. State Department. And welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
First and foremost, you are basically looking at ASEAN, all the East Asian countries and Pacific. So, of course, Myanmar is under your radar as well. So, when you talk about Myanmar, and of course, in Malaysia, it's all about Rohingya, and because it leads to human trafficking, the case is quite bad here, involving human trafficking in Rohingya. So, what do you think about this?
Well, the challenge of human trafficking and the serious challenge of the plight of the Rohingya are issues that I discussed in Malaysia, first in Kuching, where I participated in the Asean senior officials meetings, and then yesterday and today in a variety of meetings with senior Malaysian government officials. And I want to start, if I can, by saying how happy I am to be visiting Malaysia again. I've visited many times. But what's so special this year is the fact that Malaysia, in addition to being on the UN Security Council, is also the chair of ASEAN. And so the meetings that were chaired by the Malaysian Secretary General of the Foreign Ministry in Kuching included the representatives from Myanmar, from Indonesia, from Thailand, and also from Bangladesh, because this included the senior officials for what we call the ASEAN Regional Forum, which includes a lot of partners. We talked in depth about the challenge of the irregular migration, people who are either trafficked by human smugglers, or who in some cases are economic migrants, or who in the case of the Rohingyas from Rakhine State are fleeing very, very difficult circumstances. I think there's a broad agreement that job number one is the humanitarian rescue of people whose lives are at risk. And in that crisis, Malaysia has stepped up in a very admirable way. I'm proud that the United States and Malaysia have worked closely together on things like overflight to find boats with very vulnerable people in danger. We're appreciative of the hospitality that Malaysia has provided to many migrants and refugees, including Rohingyas. We all agreed that we need to cooperate closely in combating the criminal gangs that traffic people and that foster this migration. And lastly, we all agreed that it's really important to address the more fundamental problems, the root causes that drive people in desperation to get on these boats and to put their lives at risk.
Many years ago, a couple of years ago, I'm sorry, the Myanmar government applied to promise to reform the way they rule the country, democratization. And but looking at this issue, the Rohingya issue, and what's happening in Rakhine State, do you think it's a step forward or something that is regressive?
Well, I believe that a nation is judged by how it treats its weakest and most vulnerable members. And each of us, particularly multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious countries like the United States, like Malaysia, like Myanmar, need to work at creating a culture and a climate of tolerance. We need to ensure that pluralism translates into good policies and good practices that empower even the smallest minorities. Now, I know not only in Myanmar, but that in our own countries as well, there are challenges. There are challenges of racial intolerance and religious intolerance. On the broader scale, Malaysia, the United States, our partner countries are facing the very serious threat of radical violence.
Well, many people say that it's because of the ASEAN's non-interference policy. That is why member countries of ASEAN like Malaysia and Indonesia cannot really scrutinize or criticize Myanmar of what due to what happening in Rakhine State. So we're going to take a very short break for a while, and when we come back, I'm going to ask you about because there are ideas, or there are a lot of people are saying we should lift this policy, the non-interference policy. What do you think about that? We'll share his thoughts right after this.
Okay.
Well, I'm still with Mr. Daniel Russel. He is the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the U.S. State Department. So, the ASEAN's non-interference policy, what do you think about it?
Well, look, no one has ever accused the United States of not speaking out clearly when we object or have concerns about the behavior of another country. But that's not interference. That's not interference in the sovereign affairs of another state. Of course, we all do and should respect that. But when the policies of another government, particularly a neighbor, generate problems that spill over borders, that intrude into international space, then we all have a responsibility to work honestly and collaboratively to try to advance a solution. And sometimes that means speaking out about injustice. Sometimes that means addressing a problem or a policy that is driving problems or instability. Now, the good news is that ASEAN has developed a growing record of speaking out on major international and global challenges as well. I'm proud that in last November at the U.S. ASEAN leaders meeting, the 11 leaders, including President Obama, issued a very strong statement on climate change, for example. In the East Asia Summit, the leaders addressed transnational threats like ISIL and violent extremism, like the threat of global pandemics like Ebola. Now, there are issues of human rights, there are issues of good governance that are not intrusions into the sovereign affairs of another nation. We're talking about universal rights. We're talking about universal freedoms. And so if the issue is the freedom and the right of minorities to participate in the political and the social life of a nation, or if the issue is the right of every country to exercise freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Speaking to these global principles, defending international law is in no way intruding on national sovereignty. And I think that's part of the reason that ASEAN has developed more and more capacity to engage on these big issues.
Well, speaking of the South China Sea and China's involvement in South China Sea by building of military base in the middle of South China Sea, is this something that we should be afraid of?
The issue here is how nations collectively will deal with the international space that we all share. The South China Sea doesn't belong to you or to me. It doesn't belong to any one country. This is international waters. Now, within those international waters, there are multiple claims to land features. All of the claimants are signatories to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They've undertaken a solemn legal commitment to make their claims in a way that's consistent with international law. Making those claims is important, but equally important is exercising restraint, respect for neighbors, and good judgment. The United States, because we're not a claimant, that we don't have any territory there that we say is ours or that we have our eye on, is in a position to speak objectively. We're neutral on the question of whether a particular land feature belongs to Malaysia or it belongs to Indonesia or the Philippines or whether it belongs to China. But what we're not neutral on is the principle that international law applies equally to all countries, whether they're big and strong or whether they're small. That's the fundamental principle that has kept the peace, that's kept stability over these decades. That's the fundamental principle that has allowed China to grow and prosper and get rich. So we believe that the smallest boat, a fishing boat or a cargo boat, whether it's from Malaysia or whether it's from Vietnam, has the same right to international waters, the same freedom of navigation that the strongest American warship has, that any Chinese warship has. That's the principle of universal international law.
So they're building the base. The base is there. So what should we do? I mean, you see, Malaysia and China, government-to-government relationship is strong. It's very strong. And people-to-people relationship is also very strong. So how, from your point of view, should Malaysia play its role as a member state of ASEAN in tackling this issue?
Yes. Well, I'll give you an example of how Malaysia has contributed in a very significant way to a peaceful resolution of the tensions that are being driven by the construction of these outposts and the militarization of these outposts by our friend and your neighbor, China. Late in April, when the 10 leaders of ASEAN met for the 26th ASEAN Summit, after a lot of internal deliberation, the Malaysian chair, your prime minister, issued a statement on behalf of ASEAN in which he spoke very directly, very pointedly about the concerns over the ongoing and massive reclamation in the South China Sea. That's an important message that was heard loud and clear by the leadership in China. And what it signaled, among other things, is that ASEAN is united. ASEAN is of a single mind. It's not just the countries that have their own claims. It's not just countries like the Philippines that have filed a legal suit in the arbitration court under UNCLOS. It's all of ASEAN, and the world and the United States along with it strongly support that signal.
All right, we're gonna take another short break, and when we come back, we'll talk about fostering strong relationship U.S.-Malaysia. After, you see, President Obama is ending his term, and
not for another 20 months, don't worry.
But would that be any change after 20 months? Because we love Mr. Obama. He was here, and we adore him, of course. We'll talk about that. Stay tuned after this.
Great.
Bertemu lagi dalam Agenda Awani. I'm still with Mr. Daniel Russel. He's the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Mr. Russel, in the next 20 months, President Obama going to end his term, and well, we cannot predict who's going to be the next president. But what would happen for the all the efforts done by President Obama in fostering U.S. and ASEAN, U.S. and East Asian relationship, because he's somehow gravitated towards this part of the region. He went to Malaysia, he went to Indonesia, and it means a lot, of course. So how do you see that this policy going to continue post President Obama?
That is really a great question. Now, it's absolutely true that President Obama lived in Southeast Asia, not all that far from here, when he was a child. It's absolutely true that President Obama was raised in Hawaii, Pacific Island. But that's not why President Obama has so strongly championed the policy of engaging strategically with Asia, and particularly with Southeast Asia. That's not the reason why the U.S. and Malaysia now have such a good and broad relationship. The reason is it's in the best interests of the United States.
Right.
Not only is Obama a Pacific president, but the United States is a Pacific nation. And there is tremendous growth, there's tremendous opportunity. We have deep, deep partnerships and friendships in this region. Any president of the United States will pursue those interests. Now, the support for our rebalance in the Asia-Pacific is just as strong on the Democratic side as it is on the Republican side. It's not only in the White House, it's in the Congress as well. One of the reasons for that is that America's economic future and our security future is so closely linked to that of ASEAN and closely linked to that of Malaysia. So whoever becomes the next president of the United States, and of course we don't know who that will be, is going to want to pursue policies that benefit the American people and that benefit our interests. Now, with Malaysia, the U.S.-Malaysian trading relationship has grown by leaps and bounds. We both benefit from it. We expect that by the end of this year, the TPP trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, will be completed. That will open the door to huge growth in trade and investment. We have built a very significant degree of academic exchange, student exchange, people-to-people cooperation. I just met with a group of young Malaysians who were in the White House last week, who met with President Obama for an open discussion. We have cooperation on global issues. This month, Malaysia is the president of the UN Security Council. Malaysia is leading the work of the Security Council on global issues. In November, the ASEAN leaders meetings and the East Asia Summit will bring President Obama and others together. In the future, other U.S. presidents will continue to come because it's so much in our own interest.
So it's strategically, it's very strategic. And then in the future, I still remember there was a speech by President Obama to foster, instead of bilateral, but multilateral collaboration. Would you foresee this to continue as well?
We all want to see in East Asia some kind of regional structure that brings countries together in a cooperative effort to deal with the global threats that we all face. We face threats from climate change. We need to work together on food security, water security. We need to cooperate to find new sources of energy, particularly clean energy, that are sustainable so that we're not damaging the environment. We need to cooperate and collaborate against the threat from violent extremism and terrorism or drugs and other problems. So for that reason, we need not just bilateral relationships, but multilateral relationships. And ASEAN is at the center. ASEAN centrality means that the United States and China, Japan and Australia can all cooperate.
But ASEAN currently doesn't have a formal structure like you have in the Europe, for instance. ASEAN Council, for instance, is something that is not it's not as what I see in Europe. In a couple of years, what do you think the ASEAN should be like?
We see the growth of ASEAN integration in the completion of the ASEAN Economic Community by the end of this year.
Yes.
That is a major milestone. It's not the end of a process, it's the beginning of a process. We see also the emergence of a political community in the form of the regular gatherings of the leaders, of the foreign ministers, the justice ministers. This is a major process that will contribute to the stability of the region. So I don't make a direct comparison between the regional institutions that evolved slowly in Europe. There are a lot of differences. But the principle is the same. We're all safer, we're all wealthier, we're all happier, frankly, when we're working according to a common set of goals.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel Russel. That's all the time we have today. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. And sekian sahaja agenda Awani malam ini. Saya Syafzan Johari. Sebenarnya cadangan hantarkan ke platform-platform sosial media kami. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much.